Welcome to this very special Harvard, Brown, MIT webinar on the India-China border crisis. We have an all-star panel today who needs no introduction, but I will briefly introduce them before we start. Along with Ashu Varshney, Patrick Heller, and Prerna Singh, we run the South Asia Seminar Series. This is our second event of the semester. And we're delighted to have Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, who briefly dropped out because of connectivity issues, I assume in Delhi, and will hopefully be able to join us. He was National Security Advisor under the Manmohan Singh UPA government, Ambassador to China, High Commissioner to Pakistan. He has a wide range of experience in Indian national security affairs and diplomacy, and he'll be providing sort of India's perspective on the crisis, which has now been ongoing since early May, and witnessed an acute event in June of this year, June 15th, 2020. There was a fatal clash for the first time in decades on the India-China border, where at least 20 Indian soldiers lost their lives. And India and China have amassed and continue to amass forces along the border, since May, with no signs of disengagement. And so the seminar is going to walk through essentially the different perspectives: the Indian perspective, the Chinese perspective, and then the global perspective. Ambassador Menon, when he joins us, will discuss the Indian perspective. We have the world's leading expert on China's border disputes, Professor Taylor Fravel, my colleague at MIT, who has literally written the book on China's border disputes and China's defense strategy. So we'll have Professor Fravel talk about Chinese motivations for why it pushed across this long swath of the line of actual control and shows no interest at this point in disengaging or relinquishing the territory it holds that it previously did not hold prior to May. And we're delighted to have Dr. Tanvi Madan, who's a director of the India Project at the Brookings Institute and a senior fellow. She has written the book on India-China-US relations, The Fateful Triangle. Right before the pandemic hit, we were supposed to have Tanvi join us for a live seminar, and it was literally that week that we locked down, so we had to postpone it. But we're delighted to have her here today, and she'll talk about the international perspective and where India-China-US relations and India's relations more broadly with the world may go from here. Since Ambassador Menon seems to still be having technical issues, we will start with Professor Fravel, who can maybe give us the Chinese perspective on why the extent of Chinese pressure, not just in the line of actual control, but maybe at other points in Asia as well, and what Chinese motivations and objectives are in this dispute and in its India relations. Professor Fravel, why don't I turn it over to you, maybe 10 minutes each or so, and then I will ask some questions of the panelists to kick us off. And if you have any questions in the audience, you can type them into the Q&A, and I will pass them along to the panelists. And we'll go to about 12:30, so we have about an hour and a half. So with that, please join me in thanking everybody for doing this today. And Professor Fravel, Taylor, why don't you start with maybe the Chinese perspective on the dispute?
Great. Thanks, Vipin, and thanks to everyone who's helped organize this webinar. It's great to be here today with my fellow panelists and with all of you. I thought I'd try to make 6 points in 10 minutes, maybe 12, if I can do 2 minutes a point. But since I'm going first, my first point will be focusing just a little bit on background, like what are we talking about in terms of the China-India dispute? And I realize this may be old hat for many people, but not for everyone. And so very briefly, right, China and India dispute 3 sectors of territory. The eastern sector comprises around 90,000 square kilometers, more or less overlaps with the present state of Arunachal Pradesh. It's been more or less under Indian control the entire time that it's been contested between the two countries. Then you have the middle or central sector, which is quite small, about 2,000 square kilometers in size. Control here has been divided between the two countries. And then finally, of the Western sector. And China and India have different ways of measuring this because it depends upon whether or not you include territory that India claims, or India and Pakistan dispute. So I'm going to focus on how China views it here, because I'm trying to channel the Chinese perspective. It's about 33,000 square kilometers in size, and China controls most of the Western sector. So it's a very large dispute, right, which is the big takeaway. And it's been around for a very long time. But I want to get to the present, which focuses on the Western sector, also referred to as Ladakh or Aksai Chin. And here it's important to note that there's no agreed upon boundary. Obviously, the territory is contested, but there's something that is described as the line of actual control, which is a sort of a de facto line of separation, and probably both in the eastern, western, and central sectors will form sort of a de facto boundary if and when this dispute ever gets settled. In about 15 to 25 areas, and here the number of areas seems to be growing, India and China don't view the line of actual control as being located in the same place. So you have what I call disputes nested within disputes. You have the big dispute in the Western sector, of course, which is the focus of tensions today. But within the dispute over those 33,000 square kilometers, you actually have a series of subordinate disputes over where the line of actual control lies. And this is what basically has been the focus of tension between the two countries since April and May of this year. So this is my first point by way of background, wanting to set the scene a little bit. So moving on to my second point, actions. What did China do, right? So in the Western sector, in late April to early May, China moved forces up to what it views to be as its view of the line of actual control in at least 4 places. So in the area around Pangong Lake, it moved about 5 kilometers forward from finger 8 to finger 4. This is often actually described as 8 kilometers, but I measured it on Google Earth the other day, and as the crow flies, it actually appears to be about 5 kilometers. In Gorga and Hot Springs, 2 other areas, perhaps 1 to 2 kilometers from rear positions, again, to where China views the line of actual control as lying. In the Gaowan Valley, it was a bit more complicated. China moved into parts of the Gaowan Valley where it had not been present before, but in terms of the line of actual control, it either went up to or over as much by maybe half a kilometer to a kilometer. Now, in all of these areas, of course, right, China moved beyond what India views to be the line of actual control, hence these disputes within disputes, and why there's a sort of a very strong sense in India that territory has been seized or lost. Of course, I think China views this somewhat differently, as pushing up to what they view to be the extent of their claims. The situation in Depsang is a bit more complicated. In one area, you have forces that are massed against each other, but haven't crossed the line of actual control, as either defines it. But in another area, near the Indian coast of Burtsi, there is something known as the Y junction, from which India seeks to reach patrolling points, and China has sort of blocked access there since this spring as well. So all these Chinese moves in April and May set the conditions for the violent clash on the evening of June 15th. Over the line of actual control, right on the line of actual control in the Gaowan Valley. My own view is that this clash was not premeditated. I think it was a consequence of putting large numbers of forces in a relatively small area and not necessarily having a plan for how to move forward. There may have been some rotation in the Chinese forces as well that sort of broke down patterns of communication and cooperation. But my own view is that the clash was not planned, and I think this is consistent with China, the lack of Chinese rhetoric beforehand and China's approach afterwards. Let me move to my third point, or motives. So why did China take these actions? I want to focus on 3 areas in particular. The first really goes back to the dawn of the Xi Jinping administration, or when he took power in late 2012 in China, after he became General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. And put simply, right, under Xi's leadership of the CCP, China has adopted a much more strident approach to sovereignty, especially where it's contested, as well as where China seeks to maintain sovereignty within its own borders in places like Tibet and very tragically in Xinjiang. So in early 2013, Xi said, quote, "No foreign country should expect us to trade away our core interests or expect China to swallow the bitter fruit of encroachments upon its sovereignty." And so since then, whether it's East China Sea, South China Sea, China, Bhutan, China, India, you really have seen Xi's China take a much stronger and more strident approach to sovereignty than his predecessors, notably Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin. And I think the importance of sort of upholding sovereignty became even more important after the pandemic. So that's the first sort of overarching factor. The second, I think, has to do with how Chinese views of India changed after the 2017 standoff over Doklam. And just to remind everyone, this is when India moved forces across what it views to be the international boundary into what India viewed to be Bhutanese territory and what China views to be Chinese territory to stop China from building, extending, or improving a road in the area. And this, I think, for China was a real watershed moment because it signified that India was willing to use force against China, not necessarily a kinetic force, but to use its armed forces to sort of block Chinese actions in areas that were not disputed between China and India at all. And so since then, you have seen, I think, much greater sensitivity in China towards Indian actions on the border, a really massive sort of buildup of military infrastructure in Doklam and the Yadong Valley behind it. And then, as was reported most recently, right, the nature of Chinese patrolling appears to have changed after Doklam, whereby the Chinese patrols were much larger in terms of the numbers of personnel than before. And of course, we also know that transgressions across the line of actual control from India's perspective have increased during this time. Then the third and final factor, these are all kind of related to the large theme of sovereignty, I think has to do with the creation of Ladakh as a union territory in the summer of 2019 in Article 370. This included, of course, very harsh rhetoric about taking back Ladakh when the legislation was first introduced, and then issuing new maps showing the new union territory of Ladakh after it was created. And although it didn't change the boundary that India claimed in the area, I think China viewed it, along with Doklam, right, as a real hardening of India's position on the border. And so even in the fall of 2019, right, there were some scuffles around Pangong Lake. Things appeared to sort of escalate, and then by the spring of 2020, when it's much easier to move forces around, we saw China take the actions that it did. So let me move to my fourth point, goals. What did China hope to achieve? I think there are two goals, but they're very closely related. So the first is, right, China wanted to signal resolve to defend its sort of sovereignty claims against this perceived hardening of the Indian position amid the context when China attaches much greater importance to sovereignty than before. And so here we can see how Doklam and the creation of Ladakh as a union territory are very well connected. And then the way that China really wanted to do this on the ground was to reduce ambiguity about the line of actual control. So remember at the start, I talked about the areas where the two countries view the line of actual control as sort of lying in different places, and there had sort of been a reciprocal patrolling in many of these areas. And I think the way in which China wanted to signal resolve was not to take territory beyond its claim lines, but instead to, in some areas, especially Pangong Lake, Galwan, and some others, to really reduce this ambiguity and simply say, to India, look, if you're going to sort of increase pressure on the border, we can respond by increasing our own pressure here in the Western sector. And the way we'll do that is by reducing these ambiguities in the area where the line of actual control has been disputed. And so I think this is consistent with the motives that I've laid out before. If one wants to look at the motives largely in the context of the way in which the sovereign sort of views of sovereignty and the dispute between India and China has changed, I think it's consistent with sort of this focus on moving up to the Chinese view of the line of actual control. This is sort of most prominent, perhaps, in Pangong Lake with the move from finger 8 to finger 4, but is also more or less the pattern we see in other areas. Then it's also consistent with the fact that China tried to do this in areas where it had some just natural advantages, right? It's very easy in Pangong Lake for China to move from finger 8 to finger 4 because it has a road that it built there several decades ago, whereas India previously had to sort of walk in. It's also been easy for China to do that in Depsang because it has a road from which it can travel down to block Indian patrols, and it used forward positions in Gorga and Hot Springs. It's a little bit different in the Galwan Valley, which we can talk more about in the Q&A, but nevertheless, I think there's a general pattern here. And then the one goal I also want to highlight is one goal I think that China was not pursuing, but one sees sort of time and again. I don't think China was engaging in any kind of diversionary action. If you look at Chinese statements and media coverage up to the deadly clash on the evening of June 15th in the Galwan Valley, there's basically almost no attention in the Chinese media given to the actions that China's taken, which suggests that there's no effort to kind of divert attention in this way. Then, of course, if we look at afterwards, I think China also has been not trying to whip up popular attention too much, although I think this is changing after events of the last few weeks when India moved on to several peaks on the northern and southern sides of the Pangong Lake. So let me close with my 5th point. I think I'm getting out of time. I have a 6th point I want to make later on CBMs, but we can leave that for a Q&A. I think China's leadership now is a real dilemma, right? They're very strong. It's sort of encountering very strong countervailing incentives. So on the one hand, I think China's statement indicated does not want to further escalate the situation. And I realize that is sometimes viewed as duplicitous, but you keep time and again, you see Chinese statements go back to this idea of the importance of maintaining the overall relationship, which is sort of code for trying to sort of restore the diplomatic status quo ante, although not the territorial status quo ante. And this is really important for China because it basically, ties with the United States have fallen off a cliff, right? A really precipitous decline in the last 9 months. A failed effort basically to boost ties with Europe, despite the visits of Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi over the last few weeks. So the only major power with which China really has good ties right now is Russia. And I think China would like to sort of prevent that situation from consolidating. But on the other hand, especially after what happened on August sort of 29th, 30th, 31st, when India moved into new places, right? I think disengagement is going to be very hard politically for China, right? Because they will not want to be seen doing it in the face of Indian pressure, especially given how much publicity is attached to what's happening on the border in Indian media, which of course seeps back into Chinese media. So I think this is a real test, whether or not sovereignty will trump strategy or strategy will trump sovereignty. I am not sure the Chinese necessarily have figured out a solution to this. And I sort of think the default solution is to let winter come and see really what's left when the snow melts. Now, of course, I think India is hunkering down for a long winter, but I think there's a sense that perhaps winter will provide the opportunity for some changes to be made that might be harder to make in the summer months from a political perspective. So I'll end there, and thanks again to everyone.
Thank you, Taylor. That was great. Ambassador Menon, thanks for joining us today. I'd like to turn to you to get the Indian perspective, how this happened, why India believes China decided to push at various points. And there's a lot of debate in India about whether China is quote unquote sitting on Indian territory. But at the very least, it appears that China has occupied territory that it previously had not occupied prior to the spring of this year. And so how does India view the Chinese actions? What are India's objectives? There was a recent foreign minister meeting between Jaishankar, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar and Foreign Minister Wang. And although they agreed to, broad language, the individual readouts had significant discrepancies. And the word status quo ante appears to have been dropped from official Indian statements. And so what is an acceptable outcome for India now, and how does it achieve it? Can it evict the Chinese forces from these pockets that the PLA stands, either through force or diplomatically? And what is an acceptable outcome for India now, and what are the risks attendant with each of these strategies? So Ambassador Menon, over to you, and thanks for joining us again.
Thank you, Vipin. And I think, the way the crisis looks from here, at least, is slightly different from the way Taylor described it, or described what China saw as Indian reactions since 2017. Because if you look at what's happened in the spring, it's all the activity is really on the Indian side of the line of actual control. It's Indian troops who are being prevented from patrolling either near Depsang or near Pangong, in places which they've been visiting regularly for years. The PLA clearly tried to move forward into several areas and has moved forward in several areas, which changed the LAC. And it's not only in areas where there might be doubt about which side of the LAC that area falls, because to prevent Indian patrols from accessing their traditional patrolling points really amounts to breaking the understandings in the various agreements and CBM agreements since 1993. Now, I think there's a broader context in which this is happening. India has been playing catch up on the border in terms of infrastructure, roads, and so on. China's tried for some years, since 2012 in the negotiations, to freeze present force levels and infrastructure on the border, baking in the present asymmetry in China's favor. And that we've resisted, India resisted at the table. But therefore, India is about to militarily evict the Chinese. Well, that window is closing. The campaigning season, such as it is at those heights, ends by the middle third week of November, and when winter sets in. Besides, both governments have signaled quite clearly at the political level that they seek to disengage and that they want actually to find a solution. Now, their end state has so far spoken of restoring the status quo ante, whereas the Chinese have only spoken of disengagement and what the senior commanders agreed in concrete terms on the 22nd of September was to stop sending more troops, arranging the situation on the ground, and avoid taking any action, which sounds like a freeze. But frankly, I am not optimistic, A, about this being settled quickly or about us finding a negotiated way out of it. Because as Taylor said, China is framing this as a sovereignty dispute rather than as a border dispute, which is what all previous such face-offs were. The difference is that a border dispute, a difference on percent, is something that could be settled through give and take. Whereas a sovereignty issue suggests that it's not just about the LAC, then it's a much harder thing to compromise on. And it seems to me that what the Chinese did in spring, therefore, may be part of an attempt to not just up to the claimed LAC. And that's a much larger political shift. For me, the question of why we've come to this, of course, there's tactical, military, and operational reasons. It seems to me that the Chinese have, are attempting to, well, dominate the areas which both sides think are on their side of the line. They're trying to cut off Indian forward deployments, isolating subsectors in the event of conflict. And all this might be true. But these are not sufficient justification for breaking bilateral treaties, agreements since 1993, changing the rules of engagement that have kept the peace for almost 45 years, and the adverse political would have anticipated if they thought this through. Nor do they explain the timing of Chinese actions, or why China is asserting herself across a much broader range of issues. And as we've heard, of opportunism, of China ascendant, seeing an this is a China which, under an authoritarian leadership, which is willing to take much higher risks abroad, just as that was true of Mao's China, an authoritarian leader with a personality cult. But none of these, frankly, explain exactly why we've got where we are. And that makes me more pessimistic. Theoretically, three possible outcomes are possible. I mean, of course, India-China relations are being reset. There's no going back to what they were. And I think we are now in a phase where political relations will be much more adversarial, much more antagonistic. And what you're likely to see over entirely is a much more antagonistic cooperation in a fragmented world. And it's clear from the crisis that India's China policy can no longer optimize for both security and prosperity. How far that can go, how far, because the Indian government has taken steps to try and cut economic dependencies on China, which accounted for about 12% of India's imports last year. That is very, very unclear. Despite the crisis, India-China trade from April to July has actually been growing. Both sides, China and India, now speak of self-reliance faced with this trifecta of a global economic crash, the pandemic, and now the crisis. But how far that means autarky, how much decarbonization. For me, the likely political consequences, there will be external balancing by India, whether it is the informal coalition among China's maritime neighbors, whether it's India-US relations, and but the immediate problem on the border itself is going to see, to my mind, both sides mistrusting each other after what happened this spring. And that strategic mistrust, I think, is going to lead to a long, drawn-out crisis on the ground. It's not going to be easy to actually wind down these deployments. And this is why I don't understand what China did in the spring, because even if they thought that India was adopting a forward believe, by the way. In fact, for me, for the last 3 years since Doklam, India has gone out of its way not to offend China, whether it is toning down the rhetoric on the BRI, whether it is not agitate their issues, whether it was not protesting when the Chinese actually moved in and established a permanent presence on the Doklam Plateau, a place where they used to come once or twice a year on patrol, drink tea, and go away. They now have a permanent presence there. Redefining the Indo-Pacific, did at Shangri-La in 2018 to include the Chinese. So for me, that's really, it's not as though India has been following a forward policy either on or with China. It's probably, and I've seen her say this to an Indian audience last week, probably actually came to the conclusion that the progress in India-US relations had crossed a point of no return, as it were, particularly defense interoperability and the new agreements. And what the scholar in non-alignment and has the motivation to become a US ally, using non-alignment as a cover to make policy. If China had indeed concluded that India-US relations intensifying contention with the US, then China's actions on the LAC were designed to show the US and India's neighbors that India, which could not even take care of its own territory, was China, and to show India that the US is not a solution to India's China problem when it comes to dealing with China on the border. So that's, to my mind, all these are worrying sort of thoughts. These are worrying conclusions because we are in completely new territory here then, both in terms of the border, the actual situation on the ground, about which both governments have been very parsimonious in the actual information they give us. And a lot of it is just leaks, motivated leaks, and spin. Also for India-China relations and for the other relationships which really matter, India and the US, etc. I'll stop there because I think I've taken up my 10 minutes, but maybe I have a few other points that I'd like to make later.
Okay, we'll come back during Q&A and hopefully you can make whatever additional points you'd like to. Even if I don't ask the specific question, you can swerve into whatever answer you'd like. And on this point, I think is worth emphasizing on the military balance, which is what I've been following most closely. And we're looking for tea leaves, from leaks on both sides, and the Chinese are very tight-lipped. The Indian media tends to have motivated biases in what leaks out, or they're coming from the military or senior officials. The actual events on the ground, I think, are a lot more complicated than we have a public picture of. But the one thing that does concern me is the sheer number of forces arrayed against each other in close proximity on the ground at high altitude. In the air now, you have fixed wing aircraft, you have chopper activity, you have speedboat activity on Pangong So, and all of this friction over time, if persistently arrayed, really sets up, has all the ingredients for an accidental or unintentional escalation. And I understand brinksmanship is kind of the strategy here by both sides, but the key to brinksmanship is often knowing where the cliff is. And if you dance off of it accidentally, you can quickly, both governments may find themselves in a situation where it'd be very difficult to walk down. And that's the overall military picture. I think that's worth emphasizing. We don't have a lot of details, but the one thing that does seem clear is that both sides have arrayed a significant number of forces. And over time, as the conditions get harsher, that'll become much more difficult for both parties. So now I want to turn over to Dr. Tanvi Madan, who's at the Brookings Institute, to, well, say whatever she wants, but I'm particularly interested in her perspective based on her book, which you haven't read, is a must-read, Fateful Triangle, India-US, How China Shaped India-US Relations. It's an excellent piece of history that has a lot of implications for today's global relations between the United States, China, and India. And I'm particularly interested in how she sees India's relations going forward after not just this incident, but as Ambassador Menon said, over the arc since Doklam especially, and what India's internal and external balancing options are, especially given its potential economic headwinds and the relative stagnation of the Indian economy, which should, I think concerns every Indian policymaker, but also those in the United States who were expecting India to have a stronger economy to devote to military resources in the partnership. So over to you, Tanvi, and about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for question and answer.
Thanks, Vipin, and thanks to Brown, MIT, and Harvard for hosting this. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be on a panel with Ambassador Menon and with Taylor. I feel like Taylor and I have gone on the Taylor and Tanvi show at this point through the summer. What I'll do is going to talk a little bit about kind of the impact on India's relationships with China and the US, but I actually think this triangle will also have implications kind of for the broader regional and perhaps even global balance. So when talking about the impact on these two relations that India has, perhaps its most important relations in its foreign policy, I'd start with two caveats. One, I think the impact will depend on how long, so the duration, evolution, and eventual outcome of this crisis. Second, that it will depend on the posture and responsiveness of the US and other Indian partners, whether that's in the short term, whether that's in the medium term. I think the second thing about thinking about the impact of India's relations with these two countries is that the effect on these two relationships is going to be different in nature and degree, but these two relationships are linked, and I'll come back to that. And then finally, when thinking about kind of these broader impacts, I think in both cases, this crisis will reinforce and perhaps accelerating existing trends. But if you think about this, the conversation about, is this a turning point? Is this an inflection point? I think that's much more likely to be the case, already is, in India's relations with China than with the US. So coming to kind of the impact of this crisis on China-India relations, I think you've seen that it's already had that effect, whether it's in terms of sentiment, whether it's in terms of rhetoric, whether it's in terms of policies, and as Ambassador Menon said, levels of trust. Public sentiment has deteriorated, and something to remember, this deterioration had started thanks to China's approach to COVID at least initially, and so this boundary crisis has come on top of that. So I think those two things have to be linked in thinking about some of the impacts. I think this, amongst the strategic community in India, you've had a number of voices, especially many of the government's former China hands, talked about this as a turning point. And essentially what you heard them say is, look, engagement with China worked on two tracks over the last 20 years, 20, even 30 years, where you saw on the one hand that India and China track one was going to be managing the boundary dispute through a set of boundary agreements developed since 1993 and for 2 decades after that. And the second aspect of that was that those agreements laid the basis for progress in the broader relationship, whether that was economic ties, whether that was cooperation in global institutions and BRICS and other places. But what you've heard kind of a number of Indian former diplomats particularly say that in their view, these boundary agreements, that the track one that laid the basis for that track two, have essentially, these boundary agreements have been violated and broken by the initial PLA actions in May and subsequently. And particularly the Galwan clash as well, and that there can be no returning to business as usual in the broader relationship. Almost everyone has called for a reassessment of the China relationship. And that tells me that even if over time the two countries find their way to resolving this particular situation or trying to stabilize the relationship, it's going to be on different terms. And so that engagement, whenever they get back to it, if and when they get back to it, the nature, extent, and expectations of those agreements are going to be different, because if nothing else, they're going to have to find a new kind of set of agreements because the current ones, the trust in them has broken down. And so you've heard almost everybody, and I think Ambassador Menon said it earlier, the expectations of a more contentious adversarial relationship, as well as a fair amount of consensus that what this means is a need to build Indian capabilities and strengthen partnerships with countries that can help India build its capabilities, but also countries that can ensure a favorable balance of power in the region. I think beyond kind of what the strategic community and the public has said, I think significantly you've seen that the crisis has also had an effect on the Indian government's approach and policies. It's clearly hardened views in the Indian government, likely weakening the arguments of those who were calling for India to do more with China and less with countries like the US, weaken the hands of those arguing for deeper economic ties, saying that those economic ties with China would alleviate political strains or buy India time. And I think you've seen this shift reflected in the government's approach, and especially policy changes. I think you've seen the boundary crisis in conjunction with China's behavior during COVID to have reinforced and in some cases accelerated existing Indian concerns about China. Some of these concerns have been economic overdependence on and exposure to China, the inroads that Chinese companies, particularly those with close links to the state, that they have made in certain sensitive sectors, and finally concerns about Chinese avenues of influence in India. And so what you've seen is that while India's ban on Chinese apps has got the most attention, these intensifying Indian concerns due to the crisis, boundary crisis, have led to a broader slew of measures which will restrict or increase scrutiny of Chinese activities in a number of domains in India, including economic, technology, telecommunications, public diplomacy, and education. And these last few spaces are actually spaces that the Modi government, since it came to power, are actually trying to improve ties and improve connectivity with China. Now, some of these measures, policy measures, they're happening despite kind of economic strains thanks to COVID in India. And you've heard a number of kind of the same kind of former China hands essentially say, well, some of these are necessary. Well, it's going to hurt, but these are necessary to take to protect Indian interests. Now, some of these policy measures will have an impact on the opportunities available to other multinational corporations, including from the US. So this is one place where you do see this linked with the US relationship as well, though it could, if some of these measures end up being more kind of import substitution-like or autarkic, or lead to a more autarkic economy, you could see them posing a challenge to other countries' interests as well. So let me just switch kind of to India's strategic relationship with the US and the impact of that, because this crisis will likely affect the US-India relationship as well. I think in recent years, India has seen that the US is useful to all three elements of its strategy to manage China. One is kind of engaging China, and there's been a sense in India that having a good relationship with the US has actually given it leverage with China. The China takes it more seriously, if nothing else, to try to prevent a deepening of US-India relations. Second aspect of India's managing China strategy has been internal balancing. And the US has been key in that in terms of enhancing Indian capabilities, including military capabilities, which we're seeing on display during this crisis in terms of some of the equipment deployed and the capabilities deployed near the LAC. I think finally, of course, what everybody's talked about, which is external balancing, where India has seen the US over the last 20 years as a crucial member of a network of partnerships that it has built that can ensure regional and global balance of power and deter bad behavior from Beijing. And India's concerns about rising China's actions, and we've seen this in these last 2 decades, that India's concern about these actions shared by the US has been a key driver of the US-India partnership over these kind of recent years, much like it was in the late 1950s and 1960s, when kind of converging concerns that the US and India had about China led to a close US-India alignment. And yes, India does align with countries against China. So non-alignment, as Prime Minister Nehru once said, does not apply necessarily to India-China relations. So it's not surprising that you've seen this boundary crisis, that you see once again there are calls in India for a closer alignment with the US, greater cooperation bilaterally, plurilaterally in international organizations as well. I think this question of what will this do to the US-India relationship is sometimes framed as it'll kind of move from India from non-alignment to alliance or not. That I don't think is the best framing of the choice that India faces. I understand why it's framed that way because of the kind of Cold War, but as this crisis has made evident, I think even to some who had resisted it, that India is not facing the same choices it did vis-a-vis US-China competition that it did with US-Soviet competition. In the case of US-China competition, there's one country that is an Indian adversary. You want to call it a rival and make that slightly less competitive, but at the very least where there's a rival. And a rival against whom India has aligned with other countries at least twice during the Cold War. And so I think you've seen India kind of aligning. This alignment to me has already been happening, whether it's with the US, whether it's with other like-minded partners, over the last 2 decades, building this balancing set of partnerships. I do think, though, while India has aligned when it comes to balancing China with the US in a number of ways, history also tells us the nature and extent of that alignment will depend on a few different factors. One, how this crisis actually evolves. The longer it continues, the longer it'll lead to kind of calls and an impetus to building this relationship. I think two, US perceptions, and this goes to your point, Vipin, about Indian performance during the crisis, as well as what India's ability post this crisis and the trifecta of crises, the national security crisis, the economic crisis, the health crisis, what India's ability will be to play the kind of role that Washington envisions for it playing in the region. I think from India's perspective, they'll be watching very closely Washington's responsiveness during this time and its future China approach. And so while a number of people keep debating, what a new administration, a Trump 2 or a Biden will do about things like Kashmir or human rights, I think the big question for India, the strategic question for India will be the US's future China approach. And this responsiveness and this China approach will give India a sense of, it will affect India's judgment, a broader US reliability. I'm going to make 2 more points in the minute or so I have left. One is, because India has those questions about the kind of US reliability, and to some extent, even though it's seen the Trump administration taking a competitive approach to China, because there's a sense that might change on a dime, or it might affect US commitment in Asia in the future, you do see India hedging against uncertainty. And how is India doing this? As it's always done it. Diversification, which is these multiple partnerships, many of whom just happen to be US allies and partners. I think in recent weeks, you've seen whether that is bilaterally, whether that's trilaterally with Australia, India, France, whether that's in terms of Australia, India, Japan with a supply chain resiliency initiative, or whether that's with the quadrilateral. You're seeing this in different formations. But it's not just going to be US allies and partner. This is also one reason why India maintains a partnership with Russia, though it is increasingly concerned about Sino-Russian relations and indications that those might be closer than India would like or expect. Final point I will make is this network of partnerships, interestingly, even though India is doing, these are going to be fueled and have been fueled by Indian concerns about China, not just because of that, but that has been a key driver. The Chinese behavior has driven India in some ways towards China. The question is, how does Beijing then react or see this deepening and what it does to its own sense of insecurity if that's what it's coming from? So in its public statements, Beijing has tended, and this is not just in the present moment, you've seen Beijing has tended to move between saying that India is too independent to ally or align with the US, or second, accuse India of acting on US behest, something Mao also did in the run-up to the 62 war, talked about collusion with the US. And in recent days, we've seen some influential voices from Beijing stress this latter aspect. Some even saying that India is going beyond the US and taking a lead, and India needs to be shown its place. Now, this could be a mere signaling device to warn kind of India off getting closer to the US. But if China is indeed acting out of insecurity or feeling the need not to back down in its competition with the US, you could see in this deepening of Indian relationships as which ironically Chinese behavior is fueling, is in turn fueling more aggressive Chinese behavior. That's one reason why Delhi has generally tried to separate the Sino-Indian from the Sino-US problems. But I think now you're hearing a number of people in India essentially say that, look, if you look at what China's been doing around the region, Japan had offered outreach. China is pushing Japan as well. Philippines had been limiting its relationship with the US. China had pushed the Philippines as well. So that India needs to just do what it's doing with the US, because no matter what India does, China is convinced that India is going to align with the US. And I'll stop there, but I will just say, while I've talked about the India-China-US triangle, what you could also see is a deepening of China's own key partnership, that is with Pakistan in the aftermath of this crisis.
Thank you, Tanvi. This was a phenomenal panel. We got a variety of perspectives, both at the ground and tactical level, but also at the broader strategic level. I want to ask a couple of questions before throwing it up open to some of the audience questions that are coming in. And if you're in the audience, you can type in the question and we'll get it on this end. I've already seen some populate in. I think I want to open with you getting back to the causes of the crisis. And I don't want to stir up any controversies, but I apparently have a doctorate in doing so. So this last week, Ashley Tellis created quite a stir among particularly the Indian audience when he reiterated, it's not the first time he said this, but I think it's probably his clearest exposition on the causes of it in a Carnegie podcast with our colleague Milan Veshnev. Ashley, who is probably America's leading, practitioner and expert on Indo-US relations, has been at the center of it, essentially came out and said that if not for India's revocation of Article 370 and the creation of Ladakh as a union territory, the crisis would not have happened in the way it did, the changed magnitude of the crisis. And he received a lot of pushback for that. But what do you guys think about that? Because, Taylor surfaced that as a Chinese, a potential Chinese motivation. And, what Ashley said was it was probably grossly misread by the Chinese. But, it was a pretty strong explication that if not for this domestic political act, the crisis wouldn't have unfolded in the way it did with the magnitude and intensity that the Chinese brought to bear. What do the panelists think about that? Ambassador Menon, start with you, and then Tanvi and Taylor.
Well, I don't think it's a trick to yes, it made it worse than it might have been otherwise. But the China 7 and after the 370 was read down and the status of both Ladakh and JNK was changed, President Xi Jinping came to Mamallapuram, met with Prime Minister Modi, So it wasn't as though there were immediate effects on India-China relations. I don't think this was the trigger at all. And the Chinese didn't quote this as the trigger until they heard Indians saying so. And then they saw a double benefit. You know, it pleases the Pakistanis, so why not say it?
So
that said in Parliament about taking Aksai Chin back was sufficient trigger for this. No, not at all. They've heard statements. They dealt with that way politically. They took Jammu and Kashmir to the United Nations again for the first time after 41 years, and they responded to it at the level which worked for them. But what happened on the line, what happened, they're bringing the troops in, I don't see how that's a response to a change in the legalities. No, I think that was much more driven by local military considerations and by a larger political willingness to sanction it, which maybe in the past it wouldn't have been 2 or 3 years ago. And so I think it's that combination which really led to it.
So I mean, I think this is also the alternative hypothesis has been floated. It was a convenient justification for the Chinese, and the Home Minister probably didn't do India any favors in that regard in Parliament, but it wasn't a causal force. Tanvi, do you want to jump in on that?
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, one thing I would say is we're still debating why 1962 happened. Taylor and others have offered very kind of convincing, you know, arguments about what motivations. But I suspect we'll be doing this, and I hope we won't be doing it forever. But I think it's going to be hard to know for sure. I would go back to the one thing that the Chinese statements initially had been very consistent about. One thing the Chinese official statements talked about was infrastructure building. That's what they have pointed to repeatedly. And as Ambassador Menon said, we're hearing them talked about the 370, you know, more recently, and it's not necessarily come from government. The second thing I would say is, regardless of what, so I don't think, I'm not as sure as Ashley is. I haven't found kind of a definitive that this wouldn't have happened, because I think there are enough reasons to say, and they do not explain to me. The thing I cannot understand, there's no 370 with Japan. There's no 370 with Taiwan. There's no 370 with Australia. There's no 370 with Malaysia, Vietnam, name your country, Canada. Why is all this happening at the same time in this 6-month period? That's the thing that I just, you know, don't understand. Now, it could be what Taylor's saying, it's the sovereignty issue. But I think there is one more thing I would say is, but if the Chinese believe or did not understand 370, it points to a larger problem, which also points to this issue of China not seeming to understand what these actions would do to the broader relationship. There continue to be calls from Beijing, let's just forget any of this happened, let's just move on. Whereas India keeps saying, nope, when there is no moving on. They seem to have misread how this would go down. And so it worries me that if they are misreading, whether it is 370, whether it is other steps, that is a problem as well. Because one thing that there was a lot of that happened in the run up to 62 as well is just misreading each other in some good ways and in some bad ways as well.
Taylor? You're on mute.
Thanks. So I guess 4 quick points. First, I mean, really before May, there's so little Chinese commentary on India-China relations, it's hard to find a lot of evidence for any of the explanations. I think one might want to go back and do more work there, myself included. But first, so the other 3 points. First, to Tanvi, right, there are different challenges in these different disputes, right? So it might be Article 370 on the border with India, and it's going to be Vietnamese exploration of the South China Sea, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I could at least see how, from a Beijing sort of perspective, you might tie all of these things together if you are really worried about sovereignty. The second is that, you know, China, you know, there are reports certainly of China speaking out against 370 in August, September, and October, to include the United Nations. Those are what has been reported. We don't know what hasn't been reported, and, you know, China does not always surface all of its objections publicly. And then lastly, I would say there is this sort of tendency in China, right, to wait until the action has been taken before responding. And so Article 370, right, is introduced, I forget, August 5th or 6th, early August in any event. I don't think it's passed until October, end of October, and maybe the maps come out then or a little bit afterwards. And this is almost exactly sort of the same pattern as we saw with Japan and the Senkakus in 2012, right? So China opposed the nationalization, but didn't act until afterwards. Now in this case, right, November is a little too late to act, or late October, and so the response may have come in the spring. So I think one can tell a story there, but you know, for better or for worse, you know, we are not working with like a data-rich environment on the China side, to say the least, and that makes it just makes it difficult to sort of sort out these explanations, all of which are plausible. And so, but if I am right about this importance attached to sovereignty at a higher level that goes back several years, and I could see how 370 would fit into that frame from a Beijing perspective, and certainly be something that would change how they would view the situation. Is that enough to warrant the actions they take? I don't know. You know, at the end of the day, that decision making might say more about kind of policy making under Xi Jinping and the way it's been centralized, and the interagency process in China may have broken down, or he didn't receive, you know, full feedback on what all the costs and consequences of various actions were. But I certainly wouldn't dismiss it, right? I mean, I think it has to be taken into account, and we may have to wait for some time to see whether or not it was as important as has been suggested.
Thanks. So I think it's fair to say that there's probably not a single cause of this also. I mean, searching for monocausal explanations is a fool's errand in social science. It's certainly a fool's errand in the real world. And there are likely multiple explanations that converged, you know, roughly around the same time. So that's my causes question. Sort of the conduct question, I don't want to get into the military balance because I just think we don't know enough to really in the public domain, you know, to talk about or discuss, you know, the balance of forces. But I guess there are two broad-ish questions. One is, so Sushant Singh just wrote a really interesting, provocative article in War on the Rocks on the two-front problem confronting India. And this is something that at least, and I will admit that I was very skeptical of this earlier in the decade, this idea that you would have potential collaboration between China and Pakistan to put pressure simultaneously on the line of control and the line of actual control. And, you know, China potentially helping relieve Pakistan of Indian pressure on the line of control. How do the panelists think about this problem now? Is this a real problem for India now, one that we underestimated? And if so, how does India address the collaboration at the political and maybe the operational level? I don't think there's any tactical collusion or cooperation between the Chinese and Pakistani forces, but this is a problem. I mean, India now has simultaneous challenge on both fronts, and it's not new, but it's here. You know, the wolf is at the doorstep. And how does India address this? And the second kind of related question is, if India is forced to, let's call it LOC the LAC, and have a persistent deployment through the winter, you hear the standard refrain from the Indian media that Indian forces are differentially prepared to survive the winter at the altitude. But this isn't the Siachen Glacier. I mean, Pangong Tso is positively tropical compared to some of the other terrain in north of Pangong Tso and that some parts of the western sector of the LAC. Is it the case that a persistent deployment benefits India over China or vice versa? And sort of these related questions. Do we want to just go in the same order? Ambassador Menon?
Okay. On all three, on the military balance, it seems to me there was an effective balance which kept the peace for many years, for several decades. That's broken down. If not a balance, there was a deterioration. That's gone. I think that's clearly gone by what we've seen. So I think we can draw broad conclusions. We can't say how it's going to be restored, but since deterrence here is subjective, I think, you know, you can have different views of how the Chinese saw what India did after Doklam, etc. On the two-front problem, the government of India has taken this seriously for some time, since 2008 that I know of, and has looked at this. And any responsible government would have to consider this seriously, plan for it, think about what it would do, how it would deal with it. And it would deal with it, I mean, there's a standard repertoire of things to do, but primarily self-strengthening. If you look at it, 2010, India raised 2 more mountain divisions. 2013, approved the Mountain Strike Corps. Between those years, started opening up the advanced landing grounds. I mean, you can see when the Indian infrastructure started being, part of it is a response precisely to this, to starting to take a two-front threat seriously. And so when I say India was playing catch up on infrastructure on the border through this period, this is exactly what I meant. But the primary trigger was this, starting to take a two-front problem seriously. Is the LAC being LOC'd? I hope not, because frankly, neither side is going to benefit out of this. And you know, this Schadenfreude is not a basis for policy. I mean, to say that he's suffering or suffering more than me, this is no way forward for two serious countries, and especially not now. I mean, we've got enough other problems to deal with. So I certainly hope they manage to find some way past this. But you know, what worries me is if you look at recent country, talking about India-China problems being structural, which doesn't suggest an easy wind down. They're talking about it being sovereignty issues. Again, it doesn't suggest an off-ramp, an easily available off-ramp. And when I look at the history of 70 years, India and China great each other. Also told the Brookings in 1962, don't worry, in 3 years, India forget about it, we'll forget all about it, we'll be friends again. Indians haven't forgotten 62 today. We misread each other constantly. Nehru clearly misread China before 62. And I think we're running the same risk. In fact, I actually think we need today, given Chinese behavior across the board, to start questioning some of our rational actor hypothesis, some of the conclusions from that. But that is too big and radical today.
Tanvi?
So, you know, I think I'll just say kind of even further back in history, I think you've heard in terms of a two-front problem, Indian officials think back on this since the 60s. And in two ways. One, there has been consideration during India-Pakistan crises about Chinese intervention, which for India was made very real. People think about this in 71, but actually when India was really concerned about this was during the 1965 war. In fact, there were skirmishes between Indian and Chinese soldiers, and if I remember correctly, some deaths as well, some fatalities at that border. There's also been the opposite, which is the concern about India-China hostilities and Pakistan either doing something to intervene or to undertake some, distracting action, where it would keep a certain number of forces tied down. And so what has been so I think the thinking has been there for a while. I'm not, people who are and Ambassador Menon's been in government, he would know whether this is actually how much it's actually led to thinking about plans and deployment. But there has been thinking within the government. But I think that the general way that the options available has been, self-strengthening, so increasing capabilities. Now that of course depends on India has the ability, and this requires certain trade-offs that India will, if you're going to have a reassessment of China policy, you need to make trade-offs in terms of how you're thinking, not just about military capabilities, but also economic policy, which will give you the resources to build that up. But second, India has also in the past tried to get its partners to try to get either one of those other countries to deter them from intervening. So in 65, the US deterred China from intervening, and you saw, and 62 deterred Pakistan from doing so as well. And, you know, in other crises, I think, you know, more recently, US-China conversations during Kargil, for example, etc. So it's been that those partnerships have often been useful. Today, that might be hard because of the nature of both the US-Pakistan relationship and the US-China relationship. Russia, you know, India might be hoping that Russia is playing that role with China, but it's unclear how far the Russians either can go or will go to do very much. This is not a great situation for the Russians to be in. They don't like to make choices either. I'd say finally, there's the kind of big strategic option, right, which people have talked about, which is if you want to solve your two-front problem, you get rid of one of those fronts by making peace. That was used to be the standard. Now people had a different, some used to say make peace with Pakistan, others say make peace with China. Now pick your this thing. I just think in today's circumstance, that is hard on both sides. So this is, I think, a problem India is going to have to live with for a while.
Taylor?
I don't think I have much to add to what has already been said, but let me just make the following point, which is there may be a sort of a marriage of convenience for India and Pakistan to have a front open simultaneously with the other, but I don't see China as sort of orchestrating that kind of an outcome. I think China prefers to have a pretty close hold on its operations and would not want to really delegate that to Pakistan in any way. And so India may very well have a two-front problem just by nature of geography and the disputes. And for the reasons that Ambassador Menon has mentioned, right, has been working on parts of that for a long time. I still am not sure how much China would want to try to manipulate that sort of for advantage. I think China would actually be reluctant to do so kind of explicitly or in close collaboration or cooperation with Pakistan, because at the end of the day, they're not necessarily facing the same challenges either, and that would be pretty risky for China too.
Great. Okay, so my final question, because we've done causes, conduct, and now consequences. So, you know, the best time to reverse fait accomplis are very early, and it appears that the Chinese surprised the Indian army to some extent, and is holding territory in several places along the way. And initially, you know, my own instinct and theories based on no evidence, just, you know, if I were China, what would I do? I might take excess bites, give some up to look reasonable, and hold on to the most valuable ones, right? So let's say I want Depsang and Pangong, so I might, you know, make incursions in 5 or 6 places and give them up. But it doesn't seem that China's even interested in that. I mean, the Chinese strategy seems to be, so far at least, take 2 steps forward and tell the Indians to take 1 step back, right? And so here's the fundamental strategic question for India is, if it cannot, I don't think either side wants a war over this. I think both governments have basically decided, you know, the Chinese say, we're going to hold on to what we have, we consolidate our gains, we don't want to escalate. I think the Indian government has probably rightfully said, look, this isn't worth risking a major military confrontation with China over. And so the question confronting India as this goes forward is that time probably benefits China as they can consolidate their hold on the territory that they now occupy. You know, I don't know what happened at the end of August, but, you know, the Indian government is adamant that it did not cross the line of actual control, or its claim line. Since there is no line, it's not actual and nobody controls it. So the question is, what happens if strategically, if the current status quo becomes the future status, right? So if China consolidates and holds the territory it currently does, what does that do in the future to the Chinese appetite or belief in the strategic relationship about what it can do in its relations with India? How does India, the government of India, respond if it is forced to essentially accept this new status quo, both internationally and also domestically? Let's stipulate domestically, maybe this government can spin its way out of it. But are there domestic repercussions? Are there strategic repercussions if India does not compel China to withdraw from, if not all of the territory, at least the most strategically vital, whatever those may be? Now, I think they may be Depsang and Pangong So, but maybe there, you know, people have different views about it. So what happens if this is the status quo in the bilateral relationship or the larger strategic relationship? Maybe the same order. Okay, so, well, Ambassador Menon?
Well, you know, we've had, I mean, in Sundaram Chu, for instance, it took over 7 years pushing of military deployments there and elsewhere for finally the situation to be resolved and for some Chinese withdrawals to take place. You know, if you look at it over the longer term, what we're seeing is both sides are improving their infrastructure and are filling in the vacant areas. And that's what's been going on since the 80s. We've been both moving up to the line. And I think it's a myth that there is no line. Both sides know exactly where their line is and where the other one's line is. They have maps, they know where they patrol, they know what the other does. They've been doing it for decades. So this idea that, oh, there's confusion is wrong. When people change consciously and they know that the other side knows that they've changed what they're doing. There is a general impression that it's all very vague and nobody's quite sure, and therefore that's just not true. Which is why there has been peace, and there has been peace for all these years. Now, can India compel? Yes, maybe for a quid pro quo strategy, it was necessary to do it quickly, you know, Lady Macbeth, if it were done, to best that were done quickly. But I'm not so sure that this is something that is much bigger than just one piece of territory here, another piece of territory there, because both sides can embarrass each other. This is a very long, you know, border. No, not every inch can be defended all the time by both sides. And so, and both sides do have leverage. And when you look at the effective balance on that border, it varies tremendously from point to point, from place to place. So the possibility of this lasting longer, but still being able to actually work something out. And it'll be a combination. It won't be just persuasiveness at the negotiating table. It'll also be, it'll involve some amount of deployments. It'll also involve the political calculus by the leadership on both sides. You know, after Sundaram II happened in '86, by '88, we had a new modus vivendi for the relationship. We had Rajiv Gandhi visit. So you have examples from the past of a crisis like this actually leading to progress in the relationship for larger political reasons. You also have the example of 59-62, when crisis and a steady downward spiral, exactly what you were saying, aroused public opinion, media, and frankly, the reputation costs seeming too high. Ultimately, you end up in conflict. My own sense, though, and all these, I think, frankly, we'll just muddle through. We'll probably know a bit of both. Both governments are spinning like mad. And therefore, I don't think either of them today has to worry too much about reputational costs. Not today. Maybe 5 years from now, somebody might say, what did you do? But by then, there'll be another crisis and something else to worry about. So for me, it's more likely is, as I said, a reset in the relationship and an attempt jostling on the LAC, where both governments fill in the vacant spaces, try and minimize their vulnerability for the future, but neither of them can achieve absolute security along this line. And if it is to be resolved, it's going to be a combination of those plus the politics of the relationship and the situation. Let's see.
Yeah, I want to highlight an important point that Ambassador Menon made, because the conventional wisdom and the public narrative is that China exploited gray spaces or ambiguity. But you know, this historical point is also important, which is, you know, there were historical patrolling lines and each side had a claim line, but they knew where it was. So it's not as if the line was, or there's a zone that may be ambiguous in some of these areas. It's that they just had overlapping claims and the Chinese moved forward and occupied territory that they had previously not occupied. And I think that's an important point because it kind of flies in face of the narrative that, you know, this was China's exploited ambiguity in gray zones, which may not be you know, an accurate depiction of what happened. Tanvi?
I'll comment on the kind of international perceptions. I think two things have helped India's narrative. One, that this has happened in the context of China moving assertively against a number of different actors. Had this happened in isolation, people had said, well, you know, this is territory claimed by both. Maybe it's not, maybe India did something, etc. But I think the fact that it has come within this larger context during COVID, etc., has helped India shape a certain narrative. And second, because of the state of the US-China relationship. I think the fact that it's this competitive. And so, even, and this is not a Republican thing, there was a Democratic congressional hearing, but on China, not on India, or it was on China, and every one of the members of Congress asked about this in the context of Chinese assertiveness. That's the context in which. So I think whether or not this is reversed, I think the narrative has caught on. Now the question is, will that persist if you see a different approach towards China? Does the US, for example, going to stop talking about this as much? But I think, we've yo-yoed now between people say, oh my God, India needs to reverse this. No, India shouldn't reverse this because that'll be escalatory and this will lead to. So I think more or less, I think the bigger issue will be the questions that this might raise about India's capabilities. If India learns from this and it figures out that this shouldn't happen again, and this cannot happen again, have to have greater vigilance, have to build capabilities, have to think about economic policies differently, have to just be on another kind of rethink priorities. I think you'll then see, so if those steps are taken, I think there'll be less questioning. But if there's a sense that these are just kind of, stopgap measures, quick acquisitions, kind of putting band-aids, but not kind of leading to those trade-offs that India frankly does need to make and has been kicking the can down the road for years on these trade-offs that need to be made for understandable priorities, but nonetheless, then I think you will have questions about capabilities, about commitments, about India's ability, as I said, to do some of the things that not just the US, but others are hoping it can, or the kind of role it can play in the region.
Taylor?
Great. So let me make, I think, 2 points. The first is, if we stick with a rational actor model for now, recognizing, as Ambassador Menon mentioned, it may not be appropriate, but if we stick with a rational actor model for now, right? China strategically is getting into a point where it has bad relations with lots of major powers. And reversing the decline, even though there'll be a reset with India, I do think gives India some leverage in addition to removing kind of the potential for escalation and everything else. And so I think that is perhaps one way forward, and China has sort of hinted as much in its statements as well. How to bring that about, of course, is a different issue. The second comment I want to make has to do with the prior agreements. And I say this with the utmost respect, admiration, and anything else I can think of for Ambassador Menon, who played a role in these agreements. But I just wonder if they've outlived their usefulness in the following sense, namely, because of the way in which infrastructure has improved, because of the way in which both sides can reach these areas more frequently, more quickly, and perhaps more capability than ever before, and without necessarily endorsing the Chinese position, but that one just wonders how well these past agreements fit the current circumstances, and whether or not new agreements might be needed to address these areas where there are these really differing views of the line of actual control. And I actually reread some of the agreements last night, and they touch upon this, but they just sort of say when the two sides meet in these areas, they will handle it amicably and some, sort of to that effect. And I just don't know if the situation is there anymore. I'm not sure what this means. Does that mean that they have much more, they come up with new patrolling areas without sacrificing their claims, so they come into contact a bit less? Does that mean they have a very clear sort of rotation of patrolling in these areas, and you see hints of this in perhaps the eastern sector? I'm not sure, but this clearly, I think, will be what will be the sort of animating force in the border for a time to come, because as I mentioned at the outset, you really have these disputes nested within a bigger dispute. And if you're going to sort of bring about a more stable situation, I think the two sides together have to find a way to deal with that. And that may be the longer term outcome, if anything more than muddling through is possible, though I agree with Ambassador Menon that muddling through is often the equilibrium strategy in many international political situations. So let's just hope they muddle through well rather than poorly.
Ambassador Menon, do you want to make a point on the utility of the agreements in the current situation?
I actually agree with Taylor. I actually agree with Taylor. I think the agreements work when they're based on the balance of forces of power and when they reflect reality. The only bit from the 93 agreement that I think we should continue to use is the commitment to mutual and equal security. Because unless both sides are willing to do that and take into account the differing conditions on each side of the line, you can't just apply one formula saying we'll freeze deployments or we'll remove all deployments. And Indian access times are much longer. Chinese have better infrastructure. But if you use mutual and equal security, then you have the basis of something that could last, maybe a new set of CBMs. The foreign ministers actually mentioned that in their meeting in Moscow. And so I actually agree with that. We need to look at whether the old agreements are still valid, which bits could still work in today's situation, and especially after what's happened.
Okay, thank you all. Let's open it up. We have about 10 minutes, enough time for a couple questions from the audience. The first question I have from Eric Hagenbotham. To what extent have recent events affected Indian elite attitudes towards institutionalizing security relations among the Quad states? Tanvi, you wanna take that one?
I think what you heard is people kind of generally say we need to deepen these relationships. There is still hesitation about, it depends on what institutionalization means, right? If it's some kind of organization or structure, no. But is it greater interoperability? Is it more habits of cooperation? Is it meeting more regularly? Is it doing certain things, whether that is, supply chain resiliency talks or, even, everybody uses Australia and Malabar as the litmus test. I think that's the wrong, I think that'll happen someday. That's not the issue. I think if you think about, there are certain things I think there will be less questions about than there would have been before. Why are you doing this with so-and-so? But I actually think if you look at it beyond that, is there an organization? If you look at what India has done, not just in the context of the Quad, but in the trilaterals and the bilaterals within the Quad, it's actually more institutionalized, so to speak, than it was. So these are the countries, 3 countries with which India has 2+2s, and now each one of them at the ministerial. These are the countries with which India now has logistics sharing agreements. So I think you're putting in place some of these structures, some of these dialogues. And I think that, yes, it will, but I think there will still be this, I think we are, it's not just an India thing. I think we are beyond the age of new alliances. I think this is going to be an era of coalitions. It's going to be, whether it's interest-based or issue-based, there will be different coalitions for different issues. So supply chain resiliency, it's Australia, India, Japan. It doesn't include the US right now, and they've said it's open. You see coalitions, a D10 to talk about the 5G. You see an international solar alliance for an entirely different. So I think you're going to see this kind of mix and match. Some of those will include the Quad, like the Quad Plus talks on COVID. Others will have some members of them, but not others. What's interesting about a lot of India's coalitions, not all of them, because SEO, for example, is whatever you think about it, it's a different SEO brick, the Russia, India, China trilateral. But I will say those are very different in nature partly because I think the India-China rivalry will bleed over into them as well as it already has in the SEO. So I think they're very different, but I think you will see a lot of the coalitions India is joining just happens to have the other Quad members in it too.
Ambassador Menon or Taylor, do you want to get in on this?
Well, about alliance, there's a lot of talk about, this false binary between non-alignment alliance. Alliance ultimately is about mutual defense commitments, right? That's the core of alliance. And that's not on the table at all. I don't think it's on offer. I don't think it's on the table. So I think we're using the wrong words for what we're doing. I agree with Tanvi. For issue-based coalitions of the willing. And it's going to be different countries for different purposes. So, and that's what we're seeing. But it just so happens that because of congruence, most of what India is doing now is with US allies in the region or with the US herself. So I agree with Tanvi, actually, that what we're seeing is a much more fluid situation, but where I would describe India as actually today much more willing to lean to one side, to lean to the US side than ever before. And that's probably true of the Indian elite today. Unlike, I can't think of, at least in my working career, the last 45 years or so, I can't think of a time when they've been more willing to do this.
I mean, to underscore this point, a lot of this was happening prior to this crisis at very
But the
deep
Chinese are helping.
And the Chinese, yeah, this is classic real estate. The Chinese are accelerating something that was already kind of structurally, you know, orbiting around. And so, you know, none of this is new, but it may take on, you know, it might be catalyzed by Chinese behavior. I have a couple questions that are directed at for Taylor and about Chinese domestic politics and Xi's motivations. Is there any evidence, this is Asima Sinha, Professor Asima Sinha, is there any evidence about domestic political motivation for this crisis for Xi? And then Ann Sartori is asking you to unpack this concept of sovereignty and what it is precisely that China is trying to defend and achieve on the sovereignty dimension.
Great. So first, the domestic motivations. I mean, it's very hard to actually, I mean, anyone who tells you how Xi Jinping thinks or makes decisions probably doesn't know. So I'll just make the following observation. If there was a strong domestic motivation, we didn't see any media campaign in sort of the party and state media sources around this, which I think is pretty noteworthy. So I said in my remarks, I don't subscribe to the diversionary kind of logic here as it applies to China kind of fomenting crisis with India to deflect attention, because you would see the Chinese media play a pretty big role. And really until the deadly clash, it was just silent. And even after the deadly clash, I mean, I tracked it for a week just on Xinhua. I don't think the China-India border ever made it above sort of number 13 on the list of stories, right? Not that there were great stories to read above that. I mean, a lot of it was just about Xi Jinping and what he was doing, but that's kind of where we are with China today. So to unpack sovereignty in 3 minutes is probably a bridge too far. But I guess I will just say I think that you know, the way that that when Xi Jinping came into office, he certainly wanted to reinvigorate the party. I think there was a sense that the party had weakened. I think part of that may have been linked to not necessarily being tough enough on various sovereignty disputes. But of course, for China, sovereignty is viewed sort of with respect to territories that already govern, such as Xinjiang and Tibet, areas it views as sort of part, as well as Hong Kong, right, which is a special administrative region, but still part of China, and where there have been sort of, you know, a movement over the last year to give people of Hong Kong greater autonomy, Taiwan, of course, and then all of the adjacent territorial disputes. And this really gets to the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, which of course is not democratically elected in any way, and so has to sort of legitimize itself through other means. I think economic performance is one means. I think general kind of nationalism and pride, the China dream is the second means. I think sovereignty and standing up for sovereignty when it's perceived to be challenged is the third leg there. And I think that's what sort of unites everything that happened in the spring of 2020, when the regime, you know, when China was really on the ropes for COVID and facing a tremendous amount of international criticism and backlash, when the economy looked like it might actually do worse than it has ended up doing. You saw a much greater sort of focus on sovereignty in many fronts, and because I think that would sort of be the third issue that could be sort of laid at Xi Jinping's feet if there wasn't sort of an adequate defense of Chinese sovereignty claims, both inside and sort of outside of China. So I'll leave it at that, but it's a great question that deserves a further discussion and elaboration.
Yeah, I feel like we need another half hour, but unfortunately we only have a minute or two left. We've gotten about 4 or 5 questions that all kind of point to in the same direction, so I'll ask it like this. I think a lot of the participants are interested in, whether there will be broader escalation in a war. And I think, I said, my view earlier was that neither side is incentivized or intentionally wants to war, but you can have this dynamic where you might stumble into a conflict, especially, as you have all of these forces and equipment arrayed against each other, and now relaxed rules of engagement or revised rules of engagement after the June clash. And you're at altitude and dark, and you have ammunition and patrols that may run up against each other. And I do worry about this, stumbling into war mechanism, but there's still agency, even if you have an incident where, one or both nations can still walk away from war. I'm curious what everybody else thinks. What is the risk of either an accidental or an intentional war or broader escalation in the coming months, especially? Ambassador Menon, we'll just go in the same order that we've been going.
It's certainly higher than it was before, but these are two professional armies. As you said, they have agency. They also have control. And so if there's a risk, it's probably highest October, early November. Thereafter, probably less. And I think this is one reason why you see the kind of deployments and the kinds of statements we've had, and the attempt to keep the negotiating process going, even though it has not resulted in very much. And for me, that's a good sign that governments persist and are willing to do this. So, I would, yeah, I mean,
No, continue, sorry.
Yeah, so best one could say it.
Tanvi?
I agree. I think, there's there are many signs that they're trying to find a way to deal with it in neither side, but we think that neither side wants this. I will just say, one is the accident scenario. The second thing which is why I always add caveats, is, and why I said I was concerned about the idea that both sides misreading each other and not understanding, is if you look in the lead up to the 62 war. Now there are lots of differences. And there are mechanisms to actually talk now that they weren't, on talking terms in those days. There's also quicker ways of discussing these things with each other. But in the lead up to the 62 war, US and Indian assessments, both up till about September, early September, did not think there was going to be a war. But there was a war. And so, the historian in me both knows the differences between then and now, but it also makes me think that I'm not going to say, and yes, I know, this is kind of hedging my bets, but yeah, I'm going to hedge my bets on this with the hope that better sense prevails on both sides and rational actors prevail on both sides.
This may be the first time that you're more pessimistic than me, ever.
I'm always more pessimistic than you. I just don't say so on Twitter constantly.
Taylor, can your assessment of whether we may be misreading the Chinese? There are lots of narratives out there, conspiracy that China hasn't fought a war in so long, and this is about maybe they want a small little war to battle test their troops. I mean, is there what kind of credence should we be giving to I don't think China has incentive to start a war. Is that potentially inaccurate?
No, I don't think China has an incentive to start a war. And what military commander wants to be the one who commands troops if he's not sure that they will perform as expected, right? I mean, so like as Ambassador Menon mentions, they have control, that they understand what their troops can and cannot do. And ultimately, the decision to go to war would be made by Xi Jinping and the Politburo, but probably in this case more by Xi Jinping than the Politburo. I don't think, despite everything else one might say about China under Xi, that there is a strong incentive for a war. And so, what we tend to not focus on as much when we talk about PLA modernization is, we spend a lot of time looking at the new platforms and the new equipment and the pace of exercises. and there are lots of shiny objects, and it's very impressive what they've done. But at the same time, they write a lot about how they're unable to perform the kinds of operations that they say they should be able to perform. And this is in open sources. It's pretty easy to access. And so I don't think at all it's a case that China wants to fight simply or primarily or even partly to gain some battle-tested experience. And I think if they did, it would probably, would want, where they might need the most experience at least would be in the air and naval domains and how to coordinate those kinds of operations. The one thing the PLA has the most experience in historically, right, is infantry operations, which, or even combined arms operations. And so it just seems like, it seems like a kind of argument you would make if you wanted to, what's the right way to say this, right? Just think about reasons why China might do something, unpleasant or escalatory. I think if it does happen, I think it will, what I worry about, I guess my parallels for 62 Tanvi would be, right, more changes of troops, right? It wasn't just that, by September, they didn't think war was likely, but then troops kept moving in ways and that I think threatened the other. And so I think it's really important, right? Are we going to freeze, or will positions be frozen where they are now with the new heights that India has occupied, the positions China's already occupied, and that will sort of become the basis for, or have some sort of tactical equilibrium such that the accident or the misperception is unlikely? Or are there going to be more movements, either by one side or the other side, to outmaneuver how they've been outmaneuvered and gain a new sort of advantage before winter sets in? I think that's the real danger, the dangerous moment. I think when winter does set in, that potential for movement, decreases dramatically, and I think hopefully we'll have, pardon the pun, hopefully we'll freeze the situation such that there's a modicum of stability that can then create space for political dialogue and consultations.
Thanks, everybody. Ashu, I was looking at the Q&A chat, not the side chat. So my apologies if we missed any questions, but I could not have asked for a more all-star, star-studded panel on this really important topic. I suspect we're in this for the long haul either way, if not, the tactical engagements at Pangong-so and Depsang, the relationship between India and China will, is likely reset after these events. And so this is something that will have strong reverberation on international politics and bilateral relations. So please join me in thanking everybody for coming and for attending today's webinar. And we thank you very much to all the panelists. And we hope for a relatively expedited resolution, at least to the immediate crisis. So thank you very much. Good night and have a great day to everybody. And take care. Thank you so much.